In the spring of 1879, on a creek bend below the timbered slopes of the Bitterroot Valley in western Montana Territory, a woman named Hannah Boone stood in the mud of a dead mill yard and laid $4 into the palm of a man, who could not stop laughing. The thing she had bought weighed more than a loaded freight wagon and had not turned a single revolution in 11 years. It was a millstone, the great lower runner of a grist mill that had burned and rotted and been picked over by every scavenger in 3 counties, and the men who watched her count out her coins agreed among themselves that she had thrown her last money into the creek. They were wrong about the money, and they were wrong about the woman, and they were wrong most of all about the thing wedged deep in the cracked heart of that ruined stone. The frontier does not give up its secrets to the impatient, and it would be many weeks of labor before any of them understood what Hannah had carried home. She was 28 years old that spring, and she had come to the valley with a wagon, mule named Pike, and the tools of a trade that most people in those years believed belonged only to men. Her father had been a millwright, a builder, and mender of mills, and he had died 2 winters before with his hands still calloused from the work. What he left her was not money, for there had been none, but knowledge. He had taught her how a mill breathes, how water becomes turning, and turning becomes bread, how a stone is dressed and balanced and made to sing against its partner. He had taught her, with his hands over hers on the bill from the time she was 7 years old, in 3 mills and 3 territories, wherever the work took them, and she had grown up to the sound of stones turning the way other children grew up to the sound of their mothers singing. He had taught her that every stone has a grain, the way wood has a grain, and that a person who fought the grain would only break the thing and herself along with it. "Work with what the stone wants," he used to say, "and it will give you more than you asked for." He had said it so often that for years she had heard it only as a thing fathers say, and it was not until he was in the ground and she was alone with the trade that she understood he had been telling her how to live. If you have ever been measured by people who never bothered to learn what you could do, stay with this one. You will want to see how it ends. The mill she came to buy had belonged to a man named Asa Crane, who had built it in the years just after the war, and run it until the night it burned. That was the story the valley told, and it was mostly true, though the truest part of it was the part no one said aloud. Crane had ground the grain of every homesteader for 30 miles, and he had kept the books, and in those books he had written numbers that made families poor, and made himself something close to rich. When the mill burned, Crane collected on it, and moved down to the rail town and bought himself a bank, and a man who owns a bank in a poor country owns the country. By the spring Hannah arrived. Asa Crane held paper on half the valley, and the people who owed him spoke his name the way they spoke of weather they could not change. Hannah did not know any of this when she made her bid. She knew only that an old mill stone of good French burr, the hard quartz stone that the best millers prized, could be cleaned and dressed and set to work again, and that a working stone was worth 10 times what she had paid for a broken one. She knew the stone was cracked because she had seen the fracture running across its face like a dry riverbed, and she knew that most millwrights would have walked past it. Her father had taught her to read a crack the way a doctor reads a wound, to know which one's killed and which one's only frightened. This one, she believed, only frightened. She was nearly right. The auction, if it could be called that, had drawn a dozen men to the burned mill yard on a gray morning. The auctioneer was a thin man named Dawes, who handled the sales of dead men's property and abandoned claims, and he had not expected to sell the stone at all. He had listed it as a courtesy, the way a man lists the things he cannot give away. When Hannah raised her hand and named her price, $4, the yard went quiet, and then it filled with the particular laughter of men who have found someone to feel superior to. "You bought yourself a mountain, missy," Dawes told her, and he was grinning when he said it. "Now let us see you move it." She did not answer him. She had learned long ago that an answer was a thing the laughing men wanted, and that the surest way to keep a thing from someone was to refuse to give it. There was a broad, sunburned man at the back of the yard who slapped his thigh and called out that he would lend her his wheelbarrow, and the men laughed again, harder, and a smaller man beside him said that a wheelbarrow would not hold a pebble of it, and they ought to lend her the whole creek to float it on. She let the laughter break over her the way a fence post lets the wind go by. She paid her $4 4 worn coins, counted one at a time, into Dawes's open hand, and she signed her name in Dawes's book in a steady, upright hand, and she walked the length of the ruined yard to look at what she had bought. The men watched her go. One of them, a young homesteader named Eli Pratt, who had come only to see if there was anything worth carrying off, did not laugh. He watched the way she set her hand flat against the cold stone, the way a person touches the flank of a horse to let it know she is there, and something in the gesture made him quiet. He had grown up among men who took the measure of a thing by shouting at it. He had never before seen anyone take the measure of a thing by listening. The stone was 4 feet across and better than a foot thick, and it had settled into the mud where the mill floor had collapsed beneath it. It had lain there since the fire. 11 winters of frost had worked into the crack across its face, and a summer of weeds had grown up through the eye of it, the round hole at the center through which the grain had once poured. To every man in that yard it was a ruin. To Hannah, it was a problem with a shape, and she had spent her whole life solving problems with shapes. She camped that first night in the lee of the burned mill wall, with Pike tethered close and a small fire burning, and she studied the stone by firelight the way another person might study a letter from home. The crack troubled her more the longer she looked at it. It did not run the way a frost crack ran. It was too straight, too clean at its edges, as though something had once been driven into the stone and then withdrawn. Her father's voice came to her then, plain and dry as it always came. A stone tells you its history if you have the patience to listen. She had the patience. She had little else, but she had that. It took her 4 days to raise the stone from the mud, and the labor of it would have broken a man who did not understand leverage. She did not have the strength to lift 2,000 pounds of quartz, and she did not try. Instead, she did what her father had taught her, which was to let the simple machines do what muscle could not. She dug a ramp into the soft bank below the stone, a long, shallow grade cut with a spade, and tamped firm, so that the stone might be rolled rather than hoisted once it was free. She cut 3 stout poles of green fir from the slope above the creek, and lashed them at their heads with wet rawhide that would shrink and grip as it dried, and stood them into a tripod, the kind of hoisting frame millwrights called a gin. She rigged a block and tackle she had carried wrapped in oilcloth in the bottom of her wagon, her father's tackle, the rope worn soft as cloth in the places his hands had favored, threading it through the sheaves in the pattern he had shown her, so that one pull of the mule became 4 upon the stone. The first day she did nothing but free the stone from the suck of the mud, levering it with an iron bar an inch at a time and packing stones beneath each gain so it could not settle back. The second day she set the gin and rigged the fall. The third day she walked Pike forward against the rope and watched the great stone shudder and lift, and a thing that 11 years and a dozen scavengers had judged immovable rose dripping into the gray air at the steady plod of one mule. And then, an inch at a time, with Pike walking the rope and Hannah guiding the swing of the stone with a hand laid against its cold rim, she lifted the dead weight out of 11 years of mud and set it turning slowly on its sling, so slowly that a watching child might have thought it was not moving at all, the way the hour hand of a clock does not seem to move, and yet arrives. It was on the second day of that work that Eli Pratt came back. He had not been able to stop thinking about the woman who touched the stone like a living thing, and he told himself he had come to offer the use of his ox, though the truth was closer to plain curiosity. He found her stripped to her shirt sleeves with her hair tied back and her hands wrapped in rag, walking the mule in a slow circle while the great stone rose. He stood at the edge of the yard a long while before she acknowledged him. "If you have come to laugh," she said without turning, You are too late. The funny part is over. I have come to help, he said. I have an ox that pulls better than that mule. She considered this. She was not a woman who refused help out of pride, only out of judgment, and she judged the ox to be useful. Bring him tomorrow, she said, and bring a strong back, if you have one to spare. I have done the lifting. The dressing will take more hands. He brought the ox, and he brought himself. And over the days that followed, Eli Pratt learned more about the working of a mill than he had imagined there was to know. He learned that the face of a stone is cut with grooves called furrows, arranged in patterns the old millers called harps, and that the grinding happened not in the center but along the outer edge. He learned that a stone must be dressed, its furrows recut with a sharp pick called a mill bill, by a hand that knew the angle to a hair. He learned that Hannah Boone could lay a straight edge across a 4-foot stone and find a high spot the thickness of a sheet of paper and chip it level and find it true again. She did it by a thing the old millers called proving the stone, smearing the face with a paste of red ochre and water, called tram, and laying a true plank across it so that the high places took the color and showed themselves, and then chipping those places down with the bill, tap by patient tap, and proving it again, until the red came up even across the whole face. Eli watched her work a single quarter of that stone for the better part of a day, her wrists rising and falling in a rhythm that never hurried and never stopped, and he understood that what looked to a passing man like a woman fussing over a rock was in truth a kind of arithmetic done with the hands. He did not say much. He was learning that she did not care to be admired, only to be left to work, and that the truest respect he could offer was his silence and his steady hands. Once, when he asked her why she bothered to make a thing so exact when no eye could see the difference, she answered without looking up. The grain can see it, she said. The wheat can see it. A stone that is false will burn the flour and never tell you why. Then she went back to her tapping, and he asked no more foolish questions that day. The crack, however, would not let her be. As she cleaned the face of the stone, scrubbing 11 years of mud and char from the quartz, with water and a stiff brush, the line of the fracture came clearer, and the clearer it came, the less she believed in frost. She traced it with her finger from the rim toward the eye. Near the eye, where the crack should have tapered and died, it instead widened into a dark seam, and in the seam, packed hard with grime, was something that was not stone. She did not pry at it. Her father's first law was that you never forced a thing whose nature you did not yet understand. Instead, she warmed water over the fire and worked at the seam with the patience of a woman picking a lock, softening the packed grime, drawing it out a little at a time with a thin steel blade. Eli watched. The light was going. She worked by the last of it and then by lantern, and the night went cold around them. At last the blade touched something that gave back the dull gleam of metal. What she drew from the heart of the stone, when she finally drew it, was a key. Not a door key. It was longer than her hand, forged of iron gone black with age, with a flat shank and a square bow worked at the top into the shape of a wheel, a miller's wheel with 8 spokes. She turned it under the lantern and rubbed the grime from the bow with her thumb, and the 8 little spokes came clearer one by one, each one filed by hand, no two quite alike, the work of a man who had time and meant it to last. It was the kind of key a man had made special, the kind that opened something a man meant to keep, and it had been driven into a crack in a millstone and left to be buried under a burning mill by someone who either could not carry it or did not dare. Hannah turned the key in the lantern light. The crack had not been an accident of frost or fire. Someone had split the stone deliberately with a chisel wide enough to hide a thing the size of a hand, and then let the weather seal it shut. She could see now the small, bright bruises along the lip of the crack where a chisel had bitten and been driven, marks an eye that was not looking for them would never read, marks she had nearly missed herself. The stone had not been a ruin. It had been a strong box, and the safest strong box in the territory, because no one in 11 years had thought it worth the trouble of opening. Eli, beside her, asked what it meant. She did not answer at once. She held the key in her open hand and felt its small black weight, and she thought of all the hands that had passed over this stone in 11 years, the scavengers and the auctioneer and the laughing men, none of them seeing it, and she thought that the world is full of locked things that look like rubbish, and full of people too sure of what is worthless to ever find out. There are nights on the frontier when a person understands that the small thing in her hand has just made her life larger and more dangerous, and that she cannot put it down again. Hannah understood that. She did not yet know what the key opened. She knew only that a man had hidden it well, and that men who hide keys in millstones are not hiding things that bring them comfort. She slept little that night. In the morning she did a thing that surprised Eli, who had expected her to chase the key wherever it led. She went back to the stone. She finished the dressing she had begun, because the stone was still good burr, and a working stone was still worth more than a story, and because her father had taught her never to leave a job half done in pursuit of a brighter one. For 3 more days she dressed the furrows and balanced the stone on a spindle she trued by eye, and made the ruin into a thing that could turn again and grind. Only when the work was finished, only when the stone she had been mocked for buying stood ready to earn back 10 times its price, did she turn her attention to the key. The valley, she learned, had a memory, and the keeper of it was an old woman named Mercy Vane, who had homesteaded the upper creek before there was a mill or a man named Crane. Mercy was past 70, and lived alone with a flock of geese and a dog gone white at the muzzle, and she had buried a husband and 2 sons in the high ground above her cabin. She remembered everything. When Hannah described the key, the wheel worked into its bow. The old woman set down her cup and was quiet for a long time. "That is Tom Hale's mark," Mercy said at last. "He put a wheel on everything he made. He was the miller before Crane. He built the first mill on that creek with his own hands, and he kept honest books, and that was the death of him." Her voice did not shake, but it slowed. The way a voice slows when it carries weight it has carried a long time. They said he ran off, left his wife and his ledgers and his good name, and ran off in the night owing money he could not pay. I never believed it. Tom Hale would no more run from a debt than a stone would run uphill. Hannah asked what had become of his wife. "Dead these 9 years," Mercy said. "Of grief and poverty, and the shame they hung on her, she went to her grave believing her husband had abandoned her. There is a granddaughter still, Tom's son's girl, a young woman named Clara, who takes in washing down in the rail town and is poor as dirt, and who carries a name that men in that town still use to mean a cheat and a runaway." Mercy looked at the key in Hannah's hand. "If that opens what I think it opens," she said, "then you are holding the only thing in this world that could give that girl her name back." Hannah felt the weight of it settle. She had bought a broken stone to make an honest living. She had not asked to be handed a dead man's truth, and yet she had been handed it, and her father had taught her that a person does not get to choose which debts the world hands her, only whether she pays them. Quote, "The key, Mercy believed, opened a strong box, an iron chest that Tom Hale had kept in the mill, in which he had stored his ledgers, the true account of every bushel ground and every debt owed and paid." End quote. Mexus. The chest had vanished the night Tom disappeared. Most people assumed he had taken it. A man who flees, though, does not split a millstone with a chisel and hide his key inside it. A man who does that is a man who fears he will not survive the night, and who wants the truth to survive even if he does not. Where the chest was, neither of them knew. Hannah knew where to look, however, because she knew mills, and she knew that a careful man hides a thing where only another careful man would think to search. The mill had burned and collapsed, but the foundation remained, and beneath the foundation, in every mill her father had ever built, was the wheel pit, the deep stone-lined chamber where the great water wheel had turned. It was the one part of a mill that fire could not reach, and that flooded too readily for scavengers to bother with. If Tom Hale had hidden an iron chest, he had hidden it where the water hid it for him. It took Hannah and Eli, and the old woman's stubborn dog, the better part of a week to clear the wheel pit. The water wheel itself had rotted to a black ring of iron, and a few stubborn timbers, and the pit beneath had filled with 11 years of silt and creek wash, and the ruin of the fallen mill. Hannah did not try to dig it all. She studied the pit the way she had studied the stone, and she reasoned that a man hiding a chest in a hurry would not have carried it to the bottom, but would have wedged it into the dry stone-lined wall where the masonry left a recess for the wheel's axle. They worked in turns, one digging while another hauled the spoil up in a bucket on a rope, the dog circling the rim and barking at the splash. The water came up cold around their boots and then their knees, fed by a spring that had never stopped running through all the years the mill stood dead, and twice the wall of silt they had cut slumped back into the hole, and they began again. Eli wanted to bring more men. Hannah would not have it. More men meant more mouths, she said, and a thing like this wanted finding before it wanted telling. So the three of them dug on alone, and on the third day they found the iron straps of the old wheel's hub, and on the fourth a length of the axle itself, which told Hannah she was near the recess she had reasoned must be there. She was right. On the sixth day, with her arms buried to the shoulder in cold black silt, her fingers found the corner of an iron chest, square and hard and unmistakable under the muck, and the touch of it went through her like the cold of the creek. They raised it the way she had raised the stone, with poles and rope and patience, because the thing was heavy with water and with what it held. When at last it stood in the gray daylight streaming silt, Hannah set the wheel-marked key into the lock that matched it. The key turned. It turned hard with 11 years of rust, grinding against 11 years of rust. But it turned, and the lock gave, and the lid came up on the breath of air that had been sealed inside it since the night Tom Hale died. The ledgers were there, wrapped in oiled canvas, then in waxed paper, then bound in leather, gone stiff but whole. 3 account books in a careful hand, every page legible, every column straight. A man who kept books like that did not run from his debts. The pages told the true history of the valley, what each family had brought to be ground, what they had been charged, what they had paid, and what they still owed. And folded inside the last ledger in a different and shakier hand was a single sheet of paper that was not an account at all. It was a letter, and it was the last thing Tom Hale had ever written. Hannah did not read it aloud at first. She read it to herself, standing in the mud, and then she read it again, and then she handed it to Mercy Vane, whose hands shook as the old woman's eyes moved down the page. The letter named a man. It said that Asa Crane had come to Tom Hale with an offer to buy the mill, and that Tom had refused because the mill was honest and Crane was not. It said that Crane had then come with men and with a forged note claiming Tom owed money he had never borrowed, and that when Tom would not sign over the mill, there had been an accident that the letter did not call an accident. It said that Tom Hale, dying, had hidden his true books and his key where the truth would keep, and had written the names down so that someday a careful hand might find them and set the account right. The last line of the letter asked forgiveness of his wife for the shame he could not spare her, and asked that whoever found this would see that his granddaughter knew her grandfather had been an honest man. The wind moved through the burned timbers. Mercy folded the letter along its old creases with great care, the way a person folds a thing too precious to crease wrong, and she looked at Hannah with eyes that had not wept in a long time and did not weep now, because some grief is past weeping. "You know what this is?" the old woman said. Her voice was quiet but firm. It was never the stone that was worth $4. It was always this. What Hannah did next, she did slowly, and she did not do it the way the laughing men in the mill yard would have done it. She did not ride into the rail town and stand in the street and shout the name of Asa Crane. She had been taught that an accusation is the weakest tool there is, because a powerful man can buy his way past words, but a powerful man cannot buy his way past his own handwriting. And the ledgers, when she studied them against the records Crane's bank now kept, did more than tell Tom Hale's story. They proved a theft that was still going on. For 11 years, Asa Crane had collected on debts that the true books showed had already been paid. He had taken farms for sums that did not exist. The proof was not in Hannah's word against his. It was in the columns, in 2 sets of books that could not both be true, in the forged note, the letter named, and the genuine accounts that exposed it. There is a part of these stories where the wronged person confronts the powerful one, and that part did not happen here, because Hannah had no use for it. She did not need to see Asa Crane's face. She needed only to put the true account where it could not be ignored, and she did. The territory kept a land office and a court that registered deeds and debts, and to that office, with Mercy Vane as a living witness to Tom Hale's hand and Clara Hale as the wronged heir, Hannah brought the 3 ledgers and the letter and the wheel-marked key. She brought one thing more. She brought Eli Pratt and 4 other homesteaders whose families appeared in the true books as having paid debts that Crane's bank still claimed they owed. Men and women who had spent 11 years believing they were honestly in arrears and learned in a single afternoon that they had been robbed in plain daylight by a man who called it accounting. They did not need to be told what to do. The true books, once seen, could not be unseen. Asa Crane was never met in a courtroom by Hannah Boone, and the 2 of them never traded a word. That is not how the foundations of such men fall. They fall the way a mill dam fails, not all at once in a confrontation, but in a slow widening of one small breach, until the whole weight of the water finds the gap. The land office sent for the bank's records. The bank's records did not match the ledgers, and a man who keeps 2 sets of books has already lost the moment a second hand can read them both. There were hearings that winter, dry and slow and conducted in the language of figures, held in the back room of the land office with a coal stove ticking in the corner and the snow piling against the one small window. Hannah did not speak much at them. He had learned that the figure spoke for her. When a clerk asked how she could be certain the ledgers were Tom Hale's true hand and not some forgery of her own, she did not argue. She asked Mercy Vane to be brought in, and the old woman put on the table a letter Tom Hale had written her husband 20 years before about the price of a load of seed corn in the same upright hand, with the same wheel drawn small beside his name. And the matter of the handwriting was settled in the time it took to lay the 2 papers side by side. One by one, the false debts were struck. One by one, the farms taken on forged paper were ordered, returned, or repaid. The clerks worked through the columns the way Hannah had worked through the silt of the wheel pit, a little at a time, turning up under each false entry the true one Tom Hale had set down to answer it, until the whole long theft lay exposed in ink, undeniable 11 years of it, line by line. Asa Crane, who had built himself out of other people's ruin, was made to give it back. Ledger line by ledger line, and a man who is made to give back everything he stole is left with nothing but the thing he most feared, which is to be seen plainly for what he is. He did not go to a gallows. He went, in the end, the way such men go when their paper turns against them. His bank failed when the false debts that were its assets were struck from the books. His name, which had meant power, came to mean the thing his victims had always known it meant. He left the rail town one spring morning in a hired wagon with what he could carry, and the valley let him go, because the valley had what it wanted, which was not his punishment, but its own restoration. He became, as such men do, irrelevant. The truth had not shouted him down. It had simply outlasted him, sealed in a stone for 11 years, waiting for a hand that knew how to listen. Clara Hale was 22 years old that winter, and she had spent her whole life carrying a name that strangers used as a slur. Hannah went to her before the hearings were done, before anything was certain, and put the letter in her hands and let her read what her grandfather had written. The last line, the one that asked that his granddaughter know he had been an honest man. Clara read it in the doorway of the rough room where she took in other people's washing, with a kettle steaming behind her and the smell of lye soap in the cold air, and she did not say anything for a long while. Her hands, red and cracked from the wash water, held the paper at its edges so as not to soil it. She read it once quickly and once slowly, the way Hannah had read it, and when she came to the last line, the one that asked that his granddaughter know he had been an honest man, she pressed her lips together hard and looked away out the door at the muddy street, at the town that had spent her whole life saying her name to mean a cheat and a runaway. Then she asked if she might keep the letter, and Hannah said it was hers by right and always had been. And Clara held it against herself the way a person holds the only warm thing in a cold room. "I have heard that name my whole life," Clara said at last, her voice slow and steady. "I never knew the man. I only knew the shame of him." She looked down at the paper. "Now I know the man," she said, "and I will keep him." The farms came back. The Hale name was cleared in the dry official language of the land office, which does not sound like much until you have lived your whole life under the weight of its opposite. Clara was found to be the heir of Tom Hale's true estate, which after 11 years and the failure of Crane's Bank did not amount to wealth, but amounted to enough, a small parcel of the creek land, and a name she could speak without flinching. She used the first of it to put a stone over her grandmother's grave, the grandmother who had died believing a lie, and on the stone she had carved, beneath the name, the figure of a wheel. Hannah Boone did not grow rich from any of it. This troubled the Laughing Men more than anything else, for they had decided that a woman who went to such trouble must be after a fortune, and they could not understand a person who was after only the truth. She took no part of the restored farms. She took no reward from the grateful families, though they offered what little they had. What she took was the mill stone, which was hers by purchase, and the small parcel of creek land that Clara Hale, who understood what she owed, deeded to her for the price of a single silver dollar, so that the thing would be done properly and on paper. There she built a mill. Not Crane's mill, and not quite Tom Hale's, but her own, raised on the old honest foundation with the wheel pit cleared and a new water wheel turning in it, and at the heart of it, dressed and balanced and singing at last against its new partner stone, the runner she had bought for $4 and been mocked for buying. It ground the grain of the valley, honestly, and Hannah kept the books the way her father had taught her, and the way Tom Hale had kept them before her, in a careful hand, every column straight. Eli Pratt married a schoolteacher from the rail town 2 years later and farmed the land beside the creek, and he remained Hannah's friend and sometime laborer to the end of both their lives. And if the valley ever wondered why the millwright and the homesteader never made a match of it, the valley wondered in vain. For some bonds are made of work and respect and the keeping of a hard secret, and need nothing more to be whole. Mercy Vane lived 4 more winters and died in her own bed with her white-muzzled dog beside her, having seen the lie she never believed undone at last. Clara Hale married and raised children on the restored creek land, and she told those children, and they told theirs, the story of the honest miller and the woman who read a stone the way other people read a page. And the men who had laughed in the mill yard came around, in the slow way that such men come around, which is not with apology, for that was beyond most of them, but with the small and grudging respect of people who have been proven wrong by patience. Dawes the auctioneer, who had told her she had bought a mountain, brought his own grain to her mill within the year and said nothing about the past, and Hannah ground it for him at an honest price and said nothing, either, and the silence between them was its own kind of settling. She never once said that she had told them so. She did not need to. The mill said it. Every day, turning. Years later, when Hannah Boone was an old woman herself, gone gray and stiff in the hands that had once chewed a stone by eye, a young man from a college in the East came through the valley collecting the histories of the early mills, and he asked her how she had known, that first spring, that the broken stone was worth more than the men had said. She was sitting on the porch of the mill house with her father's mill bill on her knee, the worn pick she had dressed 1,000 furrows with, and she turned it over in her hands a while before she answered. "I did not know," she told him. "I only knew that a thing the world has thrown away has not always finished being useful, and that the only way to find out is to do the work." The mill turned behind her as she said it, the old $4 stone grinding the season's wheat, the sound of it steady as a heartbeat, the sound a thing makes when it has been listened to at last and set to doing what it was made to do. The young man wrote it down. The truest record, though, was not in his notebook, and it was not in the land office, and it had never been in any ledger. It was in the turning of the stone, and in a name a girl could speak without flinching, and in an old iron key with a wheel, worked into its bow, hanging now on a nail by the mill door where Hannah could see it every time she passed, and remember the weight of the thing the world had thrown away.